Every few years, there's a new precocious sports star that looks like they're going to be the next big thing. Break all the records, change the way the game is played, yada yada yada. And sometimes they do. Just in the past decade or so, we've seen athletes like Max Verstappen, Simone Biles, and Katie Ledecky absolutely dominate their competition on the biggest possible stages before they were legally old enough to rent a car in the US. But for every Kylian Mbappe, who had already scored in a World Cup final and won 2 league titles by the time he was 20, there are many more athletes who excel at a young age that eventually flame out. And this seems like a good time to be thinking about this, because there's a guy out there right now who's just barely 20 years old and has already won 2 of the past 5 Grand Slams and made the semifinals of 2 more. Carlos Alcaraz has all of the tools to become one of the greatest tennis players of all time, if not the greatest, and at the moment, it's hard to find a reason for him to slow down anytime soon. After making his tour debut in 2020 at the age of 16, Alcaraz absolutely shot up the rankings in 2021, going from 141st in the world all the way to 32nd. But it was in 2022 that Carlitos really started to become a problem. At the Madrid Open in May of that year, Alcaraz beat Nadal and Djokovic on consecutive days on his way to winning his 4th title of the year, becoming the youngest winner in the history of the competition. Then, in early September, Alcaraz beat Casper Ruud in the final of the US Open to win his first Grand Slam, becoming, and stop me if you've heard this before, the 2nd youngest winner in the history of the men's singles competition, and the youngest men's player ever to be ranked number 1 in the world. Alcaraz has continued his meteoric rise in 2023, winning a tour-leading 6 different events over the course of the year, including his 2nd Grand Slam win at Wimbledon back in July. For reference, Nadal didn't win 2 different Grand Slams until he was 22, Roger Federer didn't do it until he was 23, and Novak Djokovic, the most prolific Grand Slam winner of all time, didn't do that until he was 24. At 20 years old, Carlos Alcaraz is outpacing them all, and as with any athlete who's doing something we've never really seen before, I would very much like to know how this is happening. I reached out to Georgia Miller, a mental performance coach for Peak Performance Sports in Orlando, Florida. Georgia and her colleagues work with athletes all over the country in a variety of sports, but she spent a lot of her time working with young tennis players specifically, making her the perfect person to help us understand how Carlos Alcaraz has gotten so good so quickly. To get what makes Carlitos so special, according to Georgia, we first need to understand why singles tennis is such a mentally challenging sport in the first place.
You're losing so many points, and I don't think people realize the stat percentage. So a lot of it is you are failing a big chunk of your match. So how are you handling all of that failure and all of that adversity? There's no one to really talk to. You're just talking to yourself. You're listening to that little inner critic. So it's really important to help break down that self-talk that you have in between your points, whether you're getting ready for a return, you're getting ready for your service, making sure that you have something consistent to come back to every single time.
Carlos Alcaraz has a few different weapons in his arsenal that are unique to him and that he can rely on when things inevitably get dicey over the course of a 3+ hour match. The first one is pretty simple. He is an absolutely unbelievable athlete. Alcaraz goes 100% all the time until the match is over, running around like the Energizer Bunny until his opponents just can't keep up anymore. He's also become a lot more powerful as he's matured physically, so in addition to his incredible energy, he now has the ability to dominate opponents through brute force if given the chance to. And knowing that he has that kind of physical capacity to lean on is a huge factor in his favor. In 2021, a group at Kansas State did an analysis on the relationship between a person's age and their confidence in their physical ability, studying CrossFit athletes from age 18 all the way to 76. And unsurprisingly, the younger athletes had more faith in their bodies than the older ones did. Carlos Alcaraz is 20, still yet to reach his physical prime, but pretty much as elite as it gets when it comes to what his body is capable of. This obviously gives him an advantage physically over his opponents, but it also gives his brain some much needed room to work with. Your brain has limited cognitive resources to devote to a task at any given time, and if you don't have to use any of them worrying about if your body will be able to hold up, you can focus on things like thinking strategically and staying one step ahead of your opponent. And you can eliminate the influence of one of the biggest destructive forces in all of sports psychology. I asked Georgia about the effects that fear can have on a young athlete, in tennis or anywhere else, and unsurprisingly, it's something that she sees quite a bit with her clients.
It's huge, and normally in practice, they don't feel that, and that's why a lot of athletes are performing better in practice than they are in big competitions. But that fear sends you into this avoidance mode. I call it play it safe or avoidance mode, where now you're playing to avoid making mistakes because your mind's in the future. It's focused on all those what if thoughts. I call it the imaginary what if lane. What if this happens? What if I lose? What if that happens? And so it's going to directly impact your behaviors and actions in that moment. So you might be pushing the ball more versus going for that winner, and versus being aggressive, because that's what got you to where you're at in the first place. What got you to that US Open wasn't your play it safe, cautious mode. It was your be aggressive, go all out, playing fearless mode.
That mode is exactly where Carlos Alcaraz stays mentally pretty much all the time. His confidence in his physical ability allows him to play fearlessly, making shots and implementing strategies that no one else could even attempt. And this is a function of his youth. He's as dominant an athlete right now as anyone in any sport, but that will not always be the case. For him to be able to parlay his early success into a career that rivals the big three, he's going to have to find something else about his game to have that level of trust in. But in talking to Georgia, I learned that not only is that sort of thing possible for athletes as they age, but something that she deals with relatively regularly.
As you get older, your sources of confidence might shift. And that's something that I'm breaking down with all my athletes is let's look at where you're getting the most confidence from. Because if it's from compliments from other people or from that immediate play, well, chances are your confidence is going to be like a roller coaster because those two things aren't in your control. We can't control outcomes, and we certainly can't control what other people are saying. So let's really make sure your sources are coming from things that are in your control. So the physical ability, that's huge. Your instincts, your endurance, your hand-eye coordination. And that's something that those younger guys might really clean on to more. Like, yeah, Carlos might be more confident in his instinct ability and his ability to run down those short balls. And then the older guys might be, their confidence might shift to, well, their strategies and their game plans and ability to read and play off their opponent. So it's just really important, again, to be aware of where you're gaining that confidence mostly from, and that your strengths and weaknesses, they might shift over the years, and that's okay, but you got to be willing to adapt and grow.
Carlos has all of the raw tools to become one of the all-time greats, and has come a long way in a short amount of time with all the other stuff too. But like Georgia said, to extend this run, he's going to have to adapt to changes in his environment to keep improving as his career goes on. But thankfully for him, he's not going to have to do that alone. When Carlos was 14, he started playing at the tennis academy of Juan Carlos Ferrero, a former French Open champion and world number one who grew up about an hour and a half from where Alcaraz is from in Spain. 5 years later, Ferrero was at all of Carlos's matches as his coach, guiding him through the same types of moments that he went through as an elite player himself. And that experience, which includes living with the pressure of being the best player from a country that cares a lot about tennis, has given Ferrero a lot of buy-in with his young protege. When Ferrero gives him feedback in a big match, Alcaraz is more than willing to listen. I saw this firsthand in his semifinal match against Daniil Medvedev in the 2023 US Open. Alcaraz went on to lose this match, but his most successful stretch came in the third set from a simple instruction from Ferrero about going to the net more. Learning how to take and implement feedback well, which Carlos does, is an incredibly important part of a young athlete's journey, and as such, it's something that Georgia spends quite a lot of time on.
I talk a lot about making sure you have this bigger perspective on feedback. So the feedback, it's helping you grow, it's making you better. Just because his coach told him to go to the net, that doesn't mean he's a bad tennis player. That just means you need to go to the net and that'll make him better, probably more successful in the longer rallies. He's like, okay, yeah. And so he took that as confidence, as a game of action, like going forward. Great. Okay, I get feedback from my coach. I trust my coach. I'm confident in what he's telling me, and I'm confident in my abilities to be able to implement that. That takes a lot of practice. I mean, I can only imagine what their practices are like, right? When he's telling him all these different things and they're adjusting and playing in different environments. So the feedback, making sure that it's not about you. You aren't a bad passer. You aren't a bad tennis player, but sure, maybe that was a bad play. Yeah, so let's work on this now going forward, and making it about the play that could have been a better play, not taking it personally and making it about you as an athlete.
That is a level of maturity that usually takes a while to develop, but Carlos Alcaraz seems to have mastered it, like most things in his life, faster than most. That is a credit to him, of course, but I can't help but think that it also has a lot to do with his coach, Juan Carlos Ferrero, who has the only thing that Carlos doesn't at this point, which is a lot of experience doing that job. Ferrero's gone on record as saying that he believes who an athlete is as a person comes through in the way they play, and if that's true, then as Carlos grows as a person, his tennis game will mature as well. And that should absolutely terrify anyone who wants to win a Grand Slam anytime in the next decade or so, but I still wonder how the same pressure that he's seemed to thrive on over his career so far has broken so many athletes around his age over the years. In 2000, 20-year-old Cardinals pitcher Rick Ankiel threw 5 wild pitches in one game in the divisional series and was never really the same after that. It was a heartbreaking example of how inexperience can make young athletes unravel under the right circumstances, but there's at least one example I can think of where the exact opposite happened in a pretty similar situation. In Game 6 of the World Series, 21-year-old Josh Beckett pitched the game of his life, throwing a complete game shutout with 9 strikeouts to win the Marlins their second title. It's possible for the same kinds of situations and stimuli to lead to very different reactions from the people experiencing them. But Georgia works with young athletes all the time, so I just straight up asked her, is there a secret sauce or a kind of Goldilocks zone to try and shoot for here?
Yeah, I think there is. And again, that kind of connects back to your self-awareness and knowing yourself and where you play your best at. So if you know that you play better when you're more aroused and hyped up and energized, then you need to get yourself to that state. If you know that you play better when you're more relaxed and calm, then you need to get yourself to that state. And I think that's good that Carlos had his coach in his corner, because his coach knows all of those little details about him. He's going to know what to say to him in that moment, where his arousal and energy level needs to be at. So that's really good.
Carlos Alcaraz is already one of the most accomplished athletes in the world, but he's got a chance to be an all-time great if he can continue to mature, keep working with his coach to get him in the best position to succeed, and always be cognizant of the areas he needs to improve. Carlos lost the semifinal against Medvedev in 2023, but from what she's seen, Georgia thinks that Alcaraz is well on his way to being able to use that experience as an opportunity rather than as a stumbling block.
Yeah, I think there's a huge piece of that is your self-awareness. And Carlos definitely had some great self-awareness just listening to his post-match interviews. You know, even from this U.S. Open, he was saying that he has this maturity level, especially from last year, how much he's grown and how he's looking for solutions more so. And I think that key right there is in between points. Are you asking yourself why? Are you thinking about why that last point happened? Because that's not going to help you focus on the next point. We can think about all the whys after your match, but when you're actually playing, you need to be focused on the what now.
The what now is really all there is to question about Carlos Alcaraz. And for my money, he's going to be absolutely fine. From the press conference he gave after the US Open, in his second language by the way, he clearly knows his weaknesses and has a plan to address them, which makes him very dangerous going forward. From what I can tell, how he's rebounded from the loss to Medvedev showcases all the signs of an elite mentality, which kind of makes Carlos Alcaraz the whole package. He's got the physical abilities, the right people in his corner, and the right mentality to do literally whatever he wants to do in this sport. The only question left is sustainability, because over the course of a given match, let alone an entire career, there is a high probability of things not going to plan at some point.
I really like to talk about, before every match, you are dealt a hand of cards and you're going to have all these challenges that are going to be thrown at you. And it's who can adapt to those challenges the best and who's going to win. I think of mental toughness, that you're still throwing punches even though you're getting punched back. You're going to have your winners, they're going to have their winners, you're going to have your aces, they're going to have their aces. But who can keep it going the longest, that's who's ultimately going to come out on top.
Players like Djokovic, Federer, or Nadal aren't great because they put it all together for a couple of tournaments. They're great because they're able to sustain that level of success over a really long period of time, pretty much regardless of what's going on around them. And at least for the time being, Carlos Alcaraz has the level of internal focus and external ability to be the favorite in pretty much any tournament he plays in. If he can avoid injuries and adapt his game when his body stops being able to overpower people, he can absolutely be the next guy who ascends to that level. Because for all the reasons we've just discussed, this kid is absolutely extraordinary, to the point that the only real question left about him is how, or even if, he can possibly keep this up. Hi everybody! Thank y'all for watching all the way to the end of the video, which I can only assume means that you enjoyed it, and if that is the case, you should totally give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. If this is your first time on the channel, which seems relatively likely considering this is my first video about tennis, then let me be the first to say hello. I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game, where we talk about sports psychology and culture, and generally enjoy devoting time to interesting people who are doing interesting things. Carlos Alcaraz definitely falls into that category, and I look forward to seeing how his career develops from here on out. But for now, that's all I've got for you. I hope to see you back here again soon for another episode. Bye!